Imagine you're standing in absolute darkness, 2,000 feet underground, when you hear a deafening crack above you. The wooden platform beneath your feet begins to drop. You're falling into an abyss, and there's nothing to grab but empty air. For over 100 men, on October 20th, 1919, this nightmare became reality. But their story begins 6 decades earlier, in a mine that defied death every single day. The Levant Mine stretched a full mile beneath the Atlantic Ocean. One section, called 40-backs, ran just 40 feet below the seabed. A single crack in that ceiling, and the ocean would come crashing in, drowning everyone below before they could even scream. But somehow, that wasn't the deadliest thing about working there. 2,000 feet down, the Earth itself became an oven. Temperatures exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Men stripped nearly naked just to avoid collapsing from heat stroke. Many worked barefoot because boots filled with sweat, causing trench foot to rot their flesh. Their only light came from candles stuck to their heads with clay. Both hands were needed for the brutal work of drilling into solid rock, packing holes with gunpowder, and hauling tons of debris through tunnels barely wide enough to crawl through. Every morning, hundreds of miners climbed down 80 ladder flights into this hell. Every evening, they faced a 90-minute climb back up, unpaid. Men regularly fell to their deaths from exhaustion. Others were blinded when loose gunpowder floating in the air ignited on their candles, sometimes triggering explosions that buried them alive. Children as young as 14 descended into that darkness because their families were desperate. This was Cornwall in the 1800s, where copper and tin meant survival, and survival meant risking everything. Then, in 1857, salvation arrived. The MAN engine was unlike anything these workers had seen. A 1,000-foot wooden rod studded with small platforms every 12 feet, powered by a steam engine that raised and lowered it in rhythmic strokes. You'd step onto a platform, ride up 12 feet, step off onto a ledge bolted to the shaft wall, then wait for the next platform to come back down. Repeat this 137 times, and you'd reach daylight in just 30 minutes instead of 90 minutes of climbing. The men called it a miracle. They didn't care that it looked insane or that other mines had already installed modern elevators. Anything was better than those endless ladders after a shift that left your muscles screaming and your lungs burning. But there was a problem nobody wanted to acknowledge. Even when it was installed, the Levant MAN engine was primitive, using one rod instead of two, powered by an unreliable engine that shuddered and groaned. By 1919, after 62 years of constant use, that machine was a death trap held together by prayers and replacement parts. Wood had rotted in the moisture and heat. Metal had worn thin from millions of repetitions, carrying up to 130 men at a time. The miners knew. They begged management to replace it, reporting how it shook violently, how landings had rotted away, how the whole structure felt like it might collapse at any moment. Management refused. Too expensive. There were plans for a new shaft and a modern system, they said, but work hadn't even started. Every other mine in Cornwall had upgraded. Only the Levant still used this ancient, groaning contraption. October 20th, 1919, 3 p.m. The morning shift was ending. Men crowded onto the platforms, nearly filling it to capacity. Many were World War I veterans who'd survived the trenches, only to come home to poverty and this, the only work available. They were 18 inches from the top of the stroke, most preparing to step off onto the surface when they heard it. A bang. The bracket at the top, worn down for 5 years since its last replacement, snapped. In one horrifying instant, the entire 1,000-foot rod and everyone on it began to fall. Men at the surface vanished, screaming into the black shaft, clawing at air as the only thing keeping them alive plummeted beneath them. The rod bent and buckled, smashing through the safety catches designed to stop exactly this. It dropped 12 feet and slammed into the shaft bottom. The impact was so violent that the top 300 feet sheared off completely and kept falling. Men farther down heard it coming, a roar like an avalanche, wood splintering, rock crashing. Some leaped desperately for ledges, others clung to the platforms as they plunged level after level into darkness, their candles blown out by the rushing air. The rod tore into the shaft walls, ripping out supports, triggering a partial cave-in. Rocks and debris rained down on the screaming men. Then, the detached 300-foot section fell another 300 feet on its own, obliterating landings and beams before finally spearing into the shaft wall and jamming in place, completely blocking the tunnel. Below, the rest of the rod had buckled with dozens of men still trapped on it, suspended in the dark. Silence. Then the cries began, men calling for help, separated from each other, most in absolute darkness. At the surface, workers knew something catastrophic had happened, but not what. John Grenfell, who'd just reached the top when the bracket snapped, volunteered to climb back down. Almost immediately he found bodies, twisted between shattered beams and fallen rock that completely sealed the tunnel. His father, a site manager, was somewhere down there in that darkness. Words spread on foot. There were no telephones. Off-duty miners came running from nearby towns. Hundreds more arrived from neighboring mines. Every rescuer had to be lowered on ropes through the unstable shaft, tying ropes around debris weighing hundreds of pounds, carefully lifting each piece without triggering another collapse. But over 100 men were still alive down there. After relighting their candles, they regrouped and discovered that other shafts, the skip shaft and water pumping shaft, still had emergency ladders running all the way to the surface. 2 hours after the collapse, to everyone's shock, men began emerging from the ore processing building. Exhausted from a full shift, plus an unexpected climb from the bottom of the mine, nearly all of them turned around and joined the rescue. Over 50 of their friends were still trapped. For 3 days straight, rescuers dug through the wreckage. Sometimes they heard men calling for help. Sometimes they reached them in time. Sometimes the voices fell silent before they could get there. 14-year-old William Lowry spent 15 hours pinned beneath a corpse before being pulled out, the first survivor rescued. He had a broken collarbone, 8 shattered ribs, and needed 36 stitches to his face. But he lived. Nicholas Thomas held on for 50 hours in the darkness, surviving longer than anyone, only to die from exhaustion minutes after his rescue on the way up to the surface. 31 men died. 5 of them were World War I veterans who'd survived the trenches. In those small Cornish villages, everyone knew everyone. Every death was a neighbor, a friend, a family member. The investigation found that the bracket was defectively made with internal metal faults. But the disaster was ruled an accident, removing all liability from the mine owners despite the fact that every other mine in Cornwall had upgraded to safer systems. The Levant was the only one still using a man engine. Families received no compensation. Many lost their homes because they couldn't afford rent without their primary breadwinner. A disaster fund raised £15,000 from across the county. An anonymous poet wrote verses about the tragedy, selling them for 2 pence each to help. The mine's insurance paid out even without criminal charges, but money couldn't bring anyone back. The mine limped on until 1930, unable to afford a replacement system in the post-war economy, and then the Great Depression. Today it's preserved by the National Trust. You can visit the beam engine on the surface, but the underground portions are sealed forever, a tomb for the men who never made it out. Ralph Ellis, a World War I veteran whose foster father died in the collapse, arrived first at another mine disaster the following year that killed 4 more men. It broke him. He was never the same again. Some nightmares, it seems, you can't escape, even when you survive.